So I just wanted to take a quick minute here and talk about inertial reference frames. I've always thought that one of the best ways to understand a new concept is to try to find something that seems to break the rule and then dig into it a little more and decide and discover why it does not break the rule. So we have Newton's first law here, and it says an object in uniform motion stays in uniform motion, and at rest is taken care of there too. Rest is technically uniform motion, it's not moving. And it remains that way unless acted upon by a non-zero net external force. So let's try to think of a situation that seems to not follow this law. And one of the first things that comes to mind for me is if you're in a car and maybe you accidentally sit something on top of a car, and then as you take a turn, go around the turn, that thing flies off the top of your car. So I've got a little car here that I drew beforehand, so you wouldn't have to see me struggle through that process. So we have a car, and I know I've done this several times. I've gotten to my car, and then I set something on top to open the door, and then I forget it's there. So we just have some object sitting on top here. Maybe it's a pair of shoes. I've done that several times, a drink or anything. And you're going along, and maybe it stays on your car for a minute. Maybe I won't draw this around. That wouldn't seem to stay up there anyway. Just got something sitting up there. And so maybe it stays on as you start to move forward, but then as you take a turn, the object flies off your car, right? And so that seems normal. We expect that to happen, but when we compare that to this first law up here, that doesn't seem to really fit. We're moving along, we're in uniform motion, and then we start to turn, right? And so we're in uniform circular motion at that point, but then we don't seem to have any non-zero net external forces acting on this block up here, and yet it flies off the car anyway. So what's going on? Is it breaking this law? And the answer is no. What's actually happening is this object up here, as you're moving forward, it is moving at a certain velocity with respect to the ground. If the car is moving at, let's say, 20 miles per hour with respect to the ground, so is that object on top. When you start to go around a turn, so you start some sort of turn in uniform circular motion, so maybe you're going along and you start to turn this way, right? So we straight and then we start to turn. We know from a previous video that we have an acceleration vector, and that acceleration vector is pointing toward the center of the circle when you start to turn. So we're going around this turn, or we're going straight and then we start to turn. Well, now there's an acceleration vector, and we know in the presence of an acceleration vector there has to be some sort of force. Well, that force is acting on the car, right? When you are turning the steering wheel, you're applying a force, right, that turns the car, or a force is being applied that turns the car. This object that's sitting on top of the car, the force is not being applied to that object. So when you're going straight here, and then you start to turn, right, this object flies off. And the reason it flies off is because while you're going around the turn, the force is being applied to the car. This object is actually trying to obey Newton's first law. It was just moving forward with respect to the ground. When you start to turn, the car starts to turn from underneath it. And so this object up here seems to fly off this way. It's attempting to keep moving forward with respect to the ground. So it's actually still trying to obey Newton's first law. And so we have to be careful in the situations that we apply Newton's first law. And the thing to look out for with this law is something called inertial reference frames. So Newton's first law applies only in inertial reference frames. So what does this mean? What is an inertial reference frame? Well, an inertial reference frame means a non-accelerating frame. A non-accelerating frame of reference. So when we're looking rid of this here. When we're looking at this car up here, when we're going along, maybe we accelerate extremely slowly and then we just start moving slowly and we're going at a constant 20 miles an hour. When we're going that constant 20 miles an hour, we're not accelerating. But as soon as we start to turn, we are accelerating towards the middle of the circle in that way that we saw in circular motion. And so the object on top flies off. It tries to keep moving forward, but the car is no longer moving forward. So if we try to take Newton's first law with respect to the car is accelerating, and so the object on top does not obey Newton's first law with respect to the reference frame of the car. So we have to have an inertial reference frame, a non-accelerating frame. When the car is turning, it is not an inertial frame. So let's talk about one more example real quick. This is why seatbelts are so important. When you're accelerating in a car and you get up to a certain speed, right? Let's say you're going 70 miles per hour down the interstate and you suddenly have to slam on your brakes. Well, if you are sitting in this car driving and you're moving at 70 miles per hour with respect to the road, the same as the car, when you slam on the brakes, you immediately start to decelerate. You're applying the force on the car with the brakes, right? And so as the car decelerates, you, as a person sitting in the car, moving at a certain speed with respect to the road, your body attempts to keep moving forward. The car suddenly slows down, but you feel this massive force this way, right? Your body is trying to obey Newton's first law. You're moving, right, in uniform motion with respect to the road, and you hit the brakes, you're trying to keep moving in uniform motion. The seat belt is what applies that net external non-zero force to ensure that you don't go through windshield, right? So the seat belts are actually a kind of a physical application of Newton's first law. So we have to watch out for this. Whenever we're trying to apply Newton's first law, we have to make sure that the reference frame that we're working in is a reference frame that is not accelerating. So if we're in an object and the object is speeding up or slowing down, we can't apply Newton's first law within that object, like a speeding car or a turning car, an elevator that's slowing down. You kind of feel this strange force of weightlessness or heaviness as it speeds up or slows down. We have to apply Newton's first law in an inertial reference frame or a non-accelerating reference frame.